And then it was like, you know, it exploded. And I didn't even know that it was anxiety that I was experiencing because I had never dealt with it really before in my life. My sanity saver for you today is having somebody to talk to that you can confide in, someone that you trust. So, for a lot of people, that's going to be a friend, maybe your spouse if you're married. Um, I honestly would recommend having a priest that you have a spiritual director, someone you can at least email or meet with in person whenever there's something going on that you're sort of trying to figure out or questioning. But sometimes I think priests are great for like spiritual direction and like uh, church teaching and even familial family matters of, my husband and I are going through this. But I think sometimes actually having uh, just a true friend to cry with, to someone who is kind of going through something similar, who can sort of say, hey, you're not crazy. This is something I went through too. And sort of the topic I want to talk about today, in terms of having someone to talk to as being a sanity saver, is anxiety and postpartum depression, because um, anxiety is something that's very prevalent in our world today. And I think a lot of that has to do with technology and social media, unfortunately. And I want to talk about it because there are definitely saints that can help you with it, and just sort of practical tips that I wanted to share with you. Personally, I never really dealt with anxiety until I became a mom. And then it was like, you know, it exploded. And I didn't even know that it was anxiety that I was experiencing because I had never dealt with it really before in my life. I definitely would get nervous about things, and I would, worry, but it wasn't, I don't think, at the same level that I would call anxiety. I think anxiety is kind of a separate thing where it sort of is very difficult to control. It's almost sort of, you're not really thinking about it. It's just sort of this anxiousness that's sort of just prevalent throughout. And for me, it was more like when I was growing up, I would get nervous right before I had like a speech meet, or before I had, um, like a big paper coming up, or something big was about to happen, and I would get nervous. But it wasn't just kind of a consistent anxiety about, what's going to happen tomorrow. What am I going to do with my life? Like that, I was sort of like, I'll figure it out. And then when I became a mom, that sort of changed, and I definitely experienced anxiety for the first time. That just sort of became this consistent feeling that I was dealing with. And a lot of it had to do with my children and their sleep and their health, and just sort of this anxiety of, are they okay? Like, I remember if they were sleeping, I would be like checking their pulse to make sure that they were still breathing, because I was like, oh my gosh, they're so quiet. What's going on? And it got easier over the years as I think it just does with each experience of a child. But then it also got harder because each child was different, and each experience with each of them was different. So, like with my first daughter, we had severe health issues that we were dealing with. So there was huge anxiety around her sleep because she was struggling to sleep, and everyone was telling me her brain's going to be all messed up because she's not getting the sleep she needs. And so I had this like huge anxiety around her sleep schedule. And that kind of carried over into all three of our children, really, is like this huge anxiety around that they need to get a certain amount of sleep. And just to, if anybody else deals with that type of anxiety, I want to give you a little bit of a breath of relief. My daughter, who anybody that knew me back then, knows that she did not sleep very much, even though she was literally, I was holding her all night long to try and get her as much sleep as possible. She is so incredibly smart. She's not delayed in any way, shape, or form. Like, she is smart as a whip. And she doesn't deal with like ADHD or autism, nothing. It's all fine. So just take a deep breath. It's going to be okay. And just don't let all the statistics and studies and online stuff get into your head. And that goes for everything, not just motherhood, but just don't Google, don't turn to the internet for the answers. And this is where I'm kind of bringing in having a confidant, someone that you trust to talk through things with. And I had somebody, thankfully, that I was able to talk through things with, a good friend of mine. And then I also had a spiritual director throughout all of this. And I'll never forget. So with my most recent child, who's now 2, uh, we went to, like, I think it was my first postpartum visit. And I had to, again, we've had some health issues with our kids, and that's where a lot of my anxiety around them exists. But anyway, I'm not able to nurse them. For some reason, they can't digest my milk. It ends up hurting their stomach. And for all 3 of them. But every time the OB would tell me, let's try again because each child is different. So let's see if it'll work. So with my 3rd child, I was really hopeful that I was going to be able to nurse. And lo and behold, it was the same story. It was causing him pain. So I had to wean right away. It was super painful emotionally, spiritually, physically. And I was just a wreck. I remember the first day that we realized I would have to wean him, I just like collapsed into my mom's arms and just sobbed. And and so I was and then, I was 2 weeks postpartum at this point. So no one is at their best 2 weeks postpartum. You just went through a huge ordeal and you're sleep deprived. Anyway, so I get to my appointment and they have you fill out this sheet of like, have you cried? It's funny now because yeah, I had to answer yes for everything. So it's like, have you cried every day, or have you cried like every day for 3 consecutive days? And have you yelled every day for 3 consecutive days? It was like interesting questions like that. And I had to answer yes for everyone. And so she's like, man, my midwife was like, oh my gosh, I think you have postpartum depression. And then I explained to her, and I don't think so. I think we're just going through something really tough right now with having to wean my child. And it was anyway. So it was just, I guess I bring that story because sometimes I think from a certain lens, you can think like, oh my gosh, I have this huge problem and I'm going to have this diagnosis, and like just zoom out a little bit and maybe like take a breath and look at what is going on in your life and what you're dealing with. Maybe you're not dealing with depression, but potentially you could be depressed. And I think postpartum and in different circumstances in life, when you're going through loss, when you're going through significant changes, you're going to have some lows, but not to let that overwhelm and put a definition on you that then keeps you stuck there. So I don't think I ever dealt with like actual postpartum depression where, there was an imbalance of something. I think I just dealt with depression for periods of time during my motherhood because we were dealing with so much hard stuff. And as every mom does, especially mothers who deal with babies in the NICU. I mean, oh my gosh, I do not know how people do that. I mean, God's grace, and that's the only way. Um, So if you're sad during those times, don't freak out and think, oh, I have anxiety, I have depression. Like you can zoom out a little bit and maybe there is an imbalance that needs to be worked with. And I did do progesterone shots for postpartum depression after my first child. And that did help me. It kind of gave me like a little bit of a pick me up that I needed. And I only did it for a couple of weeks because the shots are really large and they're kind of painful. Um, not when they go, not the shot itself, but I was just sore. But anyway, I've had friends who do that and it's extremely successful for them. I have a friend who does that every single postpartum. She gets the progesterone shots and it is life changing for her. I also have a friend who just does oral progesterone when she's postpartum, and it's life changing for her as well. Don't start that and without consulting your midwife or OB though. Obviously, it's a prescription, so you can't. Anyway, um, all this to say there are tools for you, and it doesn't mean that you have to be stuck under this definition of postpartum depression or depression anxiety. That I think a better way of looking at it is how do I move through this as smoothly and as healthily, is that a word, as possible, and realize that it doesn't define you and that it's just a season and that you'll have a different season in the future. It's waves. It comes in waves, right? And then that's just life, and that's a good thing. Saints, however, I wanted to bring this up that dealt with anxiety. There are many, but here's just a few that I wanted to bring up. Saint Dymphna is someone who also is someone who you can turn to for sleep issues as well. But she was an Irish princess who suffered from mental illness after the death of her mother, and she's also considered the patron saint of mental health. So if you're dealing with anxiety, the health issues, definitely turn to Saint Dymphna because she dealt with that herself. St. John of God. He was a Spanish knight who experienced severe anxiety and depression before finding peace in God. And he is the patron saint of mental health workers. So people who work with others who are dealing with mental health illnesses. And then St. Elizabeth Ann Seton. She was the first American born saint. And she also struggled with postpartum depression. She had several children, and then her spouse died at a young age when she was still young. And she is Oh, she also dealt with other mental health challenges, so anxiety and issues like that. Saint Therese of Lisieux was a French nun who experienced intense anxiety and feelings of inadequacy. And she's like one of the most famous, popular saints is Saint Therese of Lisieux. She is one of the doctors of the church. She really had an incredible deep faith and from a very young age wanted to be a nun and wanted to devote her life to God. So did wonderful, great things, is changing the world through her legacy. And she dealt with feelings of inadequacy and anxiety and sort of this feeling of where do I belong and how am I going to get there? So, another person to look to, St. Augustine of Hippo. He's one of my favorites. He's my dad's patron saint, and he was a renowned theologian and bishop, and he battled with anxiety and sin throughout his life. So St. Augustine really didn't find faith until later on in life, like in his 30s, I think, and lived a very earthly life up until then. And he also struggled with kind of this notion of what is truth? What do I believe? And once he found truth, he had this struggle of now I have to give up all these vices that I really enjoy because I know they're not true. And that was an interior battle for him of I don't want to give these up, but I know that I should. So again, the saints in their brokenness can help us realize that we're not alone in what we're going through and that it doesn't define us, that we don't have to be stuck in it. So I, you know, really admire everyone who struggles and deals with different mental issues. And I think the healthiest way to deal with them is to not look at them as defining that person or as a permanent uh, issue, but as one that can be worked through with the grace of God, and maybe even learned to be lived um, with the in the grace of God and used, to our advantage, and not to avoid the issue, but to face it and to heal it, if that makes sense. So yeah, I personally have never dealt with an actual imbalance that needed to be treated. And so I don't have experience with that side of things, but I think a lot of us underestimate the power of our own brain to address a lot of these things. And so I would encourage prayer, especially to some of those saints that I just mentioned, especially if you're going through like postpartum depression or anxiety and depression that's been triggered by something traumatic, like with St. Dymphna and the death of her mother, to look for someone who you can confide in and talk through those things with. I always feel better after I talk about it. I always feel better after I get it out and it's not just this interior focus. And that's the other thing that I would highly recommend. If you're dealing with any kind of mental health issues, I don't say this to sound insensitive, but stop focusing on yourself. Find somebody else to focus on, to care for, to support. Get out, do work with your hands, with your mind, with your soul. Just get to work. That is the biggest cure, I think, of depression, of interior issues, is to stop looking inside of yourself and start looking outside and finding other people to serve and to help. That is literally what my shop did for me. Instead of focusing on all of the things that were going on in my motherhood and in my life and just sinking into that, I started creating again, and not just creating for myself, but creating to share with other people, making things out of my brokenness, out of my sorrow, and sharing it with other people so that they could then take it, heal themselves with it. And then it could just be this domino effect of taking something broken and healing it and then passing that on. So that's my sanity saver for you today. Someone to confide in and someone to serve. find somebody to serve, even if it's like a organization that you want to do charitable work with. Or for mothers, I think a lot of times you're serving your kids all day long, and that's beautiful and good work, and definitely be doing it, but also look for an outlet that you can serve beyond that as well. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I'm a homeschool mom. I love spending time with my kids. But yeah, to find something else outside of that that you also can pour into to give you another perspective, another outward focus that isn't inward. Because your kids are very inward, right? You're very attached to them. You're very close to them. They are your very heart. Everything that they feel, you feel. So to maybe serve somebody else that isn't quite so close to this, interior part, so that you really can look outward, and know that I'm praying for you. And if you have any experiences, advice for postpartum depression, anxiety, mental health issues, put them in the comments. I'm sure everybody would love to hear your input because I'm no expert. So I'll see you next time.